My name is Anne Kitson from Elsevier and The Lancet, and at Elsevier we're delighted to be supporting the 30th anniversary of the Oxford Science Festival. Thank you also to Dane Comerad, who his team has helped us to set up tonight's event. Elsevier is a scientific and medical research publisher who've been working with the research community for about 140 years. Tonight's discussion is called "Why is Getting It Wrong Good for Science?" So I'm hoping we'll have a very interesting debate. Back in 1950, the world's body of knowledge was doubling every 50 years. Today, it doubles every 73 days. Helping researchers to understand what can be built upon and trusted has never been more important. Equally, as science becomes a greater part of the public debate, helping people understand the scientific process is crucial. Interviewed on the BBC last week, Patrick Vallance talked about science being the business of uncertainty and how difficult it is for scientists to be held up as experts when they are never more delighted than when a new piece of research helps them to change their mind. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our chair for tonight's debate, Tracey Brown, OBE and Director of the Charity for Sense About Science, who's going to help us navigate through this fascinating topic. Tracey has been Director of Sense About Science since 2002. Under her leadership, the charity has turned the case for sound science and evidence into popular campaigns to urge scientific thinking among the public and the people who answer to them. Tracey leads Sense About Science's work on the transparency of evidence used by governments in policy to ensure that the public has access to the same evidence and reasoning as those who are taking the decisions. This has included drafting the principles for the treatment of independent scientific advice, which was adopted by in the UK Ministerial Code in 2010. And in 2020, Tracey became Honorary Professor at UCL in the Department of Science, Technology and Engineering in Public Policy. Just before I hand over to Tracey, I wanted to introduce a short video profiling some of the fascinating science by some of Oxford's researchers.
I work on illegal fishing based on a case study in central Chile. And here what I am trying to do with my research is try to understand why illegality and non-compliance happens and what we could do to intervene in the system to improve compliance.
We studied the origin and evolution of the sweet potato. Sweet potato is one of the most important crops worldwide, but it was poorly known. So we used taxonomy, genomics, and a number of other techniques to investigate how sweet potato originated and how it evolved within the morning glories, which is the group of plants to which it belongs.
My research focuses in particular on shark conservation. That's because sharks, rays, and their other cartilaginous relatives are one of the world's most threatened species groups. And they're mainly threatened due to overfishing.
This is a replica of a fossil that we found in Mozambique, in Gorongosa National Park, and it's part of a jawbone of an animal that very likely lived around probably close to 18 million years ago. This represents the newest research that we're doing in a new part of Africa, not only for us but for science. It's an area where we're opening up research into the evolutionary past of Africa, the evolution of ecosystems in scales of millions of years ago.
For me, getting it wrong was a way to also be more humble and think, okay, there's all this science and all this theory behind, but when you do go into the field work, you have to listen, and they might prove you wrong many, many times over, and that's okay, but it means you're listening.
I think getting it wrong is a very fundamental aspect of science, because if what we're trying to do, we're pushing the boundaries, we're pushing the frontiers of what is known, and that means that you go into unknown territories, you go into areas or time periods and find things that are unexpected.
People are going to take risks in terms of doing cool new research or discovering new things, then you're bound to get things wrong sometimes. And so, you know, perhaps if you're not getting anything wrong, then you're not taking big enough risks in order to advance science and research.
So it pushes us to explore more, to explore in more detail, to take other perspectives. And also often when we get something wrong, we find new perspectives that change sometimes dramatically the work we do.
We do lots of research and we publish papers and we go into the field and we explain our results to people and so on and so forth. But then when we go to the government, sometimes it's really hard to get some messages through, and sometimes they might just ignore you or they might move on with the agenda that they have.
So it can be, you know, kind of a bit emotionally draining sometimes, sort of researching these tricky issues, especially when you're, you know, spending lots of time seeing sort of endangered species being caught, but then also experiencing the sort of challenges and poverty that fishers live in as well.
It's quite impressive how people get in touch with me from all over the world, that they want to understand more about my research, that they want to apply some of the concepts where they work.
In subsequent months and even in subsequent years, our work has received maybe more attention because of having it published. So it has been very, very good for our work.
And that's the beauty of research, is that it doesn't stay within the context where you developed. It sort of flies away and can be helpful in many other countries.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne, and kudos to Elsevier for being prepared to open up a pretty tricky question right on your doorstep, and look at some of the really difficult conversations we have about the reliability of science. Obviously, I'm waving a sheaf of papers in the hope that you think I've got some of the answers already. On a good day, we all acknowledge that learning is about getting things wrong, that it's about competing ideas to be tested. We know about uncertainty. It's all about trying to refine what we do and don't know. And we watch a channel called Discovery, which kind of a clue, isn't it, to the fact that we come to know stuff through a process. It's called Discovery. And yet, so we all acknowledge it, and yet it seems in practice we're kind of discomforted by this. It seems that it makes us a little shocked and disappointed sometimes to find out that science isn't orthodoxy. It's particularly the case if we work in politics or we work in the media, to find that we can't get a yes or no answer to a difficult question, especially if it's one that we're trying to tell the public about. And we talk about things like following the science. And some people mean by that something rather different from researchers. What they mean is they just want answers and ready answers. So even though we know that it's all about finding out, it's all about what we don't know, and trying to understand how confident we can be in what we do know, even though we know that, we do have a problem with sort of looking for orthodoxy. And scientists too. In their report on the pandemic last week, the House of Commons Science and Health Committees pointed to the fact, they singled out the fact that scientists have been too locked into the flu model as a way of understanding COVID, that they really were rather resistant to thinking afresh. So they themselves had kind of got a bit attached to a certain orthodoxy, and perhaps feared also raising some of those questions in a public, febrile public discussion. And then you've got Facebook, who's now trying to be the arbiter of good research and shutting down leading epidemiologists and so on, because its algorithms have decided this isn't good science. Well, we live in a strange world where we have that sort of approach to trying to seek scientific orthodoxy at the same time as we're talking about discovery. So we need to have a job, we have a big job tonight, I think, which is to work out how to talk about these issues, how to talk about reliability, which research is well done enough for us to rely on and make decisions, and what is rubbish, and what shouldn't have been done in the first place, and what's been outdated, and so on. We need to get used to having these conversations as a society. I've got a great panel to talk about this. I have Nick Ishmael Perkins, who is a journalist, a science journalist, and I worked largely in areas where science connects with development, 30 years in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. and a lot to draw on all sides of the fence, I think, Nick. I have Marianne Knight here, who is Professor of Maternal and Population Health here in the university, and she's really been concerned with maternal morbidity and asking some of the really tricky questions about things we think we know in this field. So Marianne, welcome to you. I have Stuart Ritchie, I'm saying in the order they're going to talk to you. Stuart Ritchie, who's a science writer. You may know him now, he writes on Herd. I love his stuff on Herd. He writes about all kinds of fraudulent science. We've got excellent books on the subject. Excellent book called Science Fictions, and picks out some really unusual areas of science where we need to question what those orthodoxies have become. And finally, Alexander Korsunski, who is Professor of Engineering Science, Vice President at Trinity College, and a specialist in the structure of materials. So we've got quite a diverse background from a scientific point of view. He's also a journal editor, editor-in-chief of Materials and Design, so he knows what it's like to have to sift through the papers and work out what's worth publishing. So those are our panels tonight. And I think, let's get it on the table first of all, panel. Science can get it spectacularly wrong, frustratingly wrong, or advanced by really small increments at times when we've got really pressing questions. So let's just hear from you about times when you've got it wrong or you think people around you have got it wrong and how that's been put right. I want to hear about that. Nick.
Okay, thank you, Tracey, and thanks to the team at Elsevier for inviting me to, I think, a very timely discussion in a pretty timeless venue. So I want to start by just reflecting on, I think, a really interesting case study of the challenge of making science trustworthy and also the centrality of uncertainty, which is so much a part of the scientific practice. And this is actually a project I was involved in, polio eradication campaign in India in the mid-noughties. And India, like many countries in the world, through the 90s and into the early noughties, was making really quite impressive progress with reducing the incidence of polio. But it became very clear by the early noughties that there were two parts of the country where this was not the case. And these were the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And there were a few issues at play here. The first is that UP and Bihar are very populous. Actually, the two states together would be the fourth most populous country in the world. They're prone to flooding, which is quite helpful for wild poliovirus. They're also places where you have really high incidence of extreme and chronic poverty. And you had a state governance infrastructure that's under enormous pressure. And this was particularly the case with a very threadbare public healthcare system. The second thing here was that you have in these states a concentration of the Muslim minority, a group which empirically had become very marginalized and had become actually quite close and also fairly paranoid. So you had this vicious cycle that was going on in these two states. And then the third thing, and this is actually really significant, was that the strain of poliovirus in those two states was actually challenging the traditional efficacy of the vaccines. So what had to happen was that they had to move from what was a bivalent to trivalent vaccine, which was basically to kind of increase the strains that the vaccine would respond to. And that meant changing the protocol. So it meant going from basically 2 drops to basically 2 drops every time there was a polio campaign. And that changed the communication as well. So it was basically sort of 2 drops for life. And now suddenly it was, well, I mean, 2 drops whenever we tell you it's going to be 2 drops. So they were going every couple of months to these communities. And that in turn fed into the paranoia because they were like, well, obviously you don't know what you're talking about. We actually hardly have any visits from healthcare professionals. And now actually they're coming all the time about this polio thing. And it meant that actually instances of vaccine hesitancy or outright resistance went up. And these pockets became reservoirs for the virus, which was why they were struggling to eradicate the virus there. And what's really interesting about this case study, stepping back for a moment, is that actually you had a campaign that started, and I was very much part of this, with this idea of a kind of deficit model, which is to say, okay, we know what has to happen. We're going to tell you because we're in a hurry. Let's get this show on the road. And we had to revisit this and start thinking, actually, okay, we need a different kind of model for this communication. We needed to make the objective of the communication about mediation and trust building, which was quite different and quite difficult in a context actually where you had a lot of political pressure because the Indian government was under enormous pressure internationally and also putting quite a lot of pressure on this broad, unwieldy coalition of organizations, all of them jostling for position and credit and funding. And you're saying to say to them, well, actually, okay, we need to take a moment here and actually have a conversation with the community, actually one that's much more open and reflexive and properly transformative as well. I mean, and then the third thing about this is the final point is actually really the legacy. And this is really important because having had all of this, and basically between 2002, which was where you would say actually that resistance was at its height in these two states, it was another 9 years before they had the last case of polio. And that's 9 years of over $1 billion being invested by the Indian government, the US government, various members of the international community, including the Gates Foundation, because at that time polio was a priority for them. So, but now when you look back on the story, it's a story of success. That's what it is, basically. Nothing about actually the iterations of the science around virology and epidemiology, nothing about the awkward kind of intersection of scientific inquiry and contested political narratives, nothing about this kind of massive shift in communication models. It was just a huge logistical success.
Of course. Thank you, Nick. About the science we communicate is an interesting end to start with this discussion. And then Marion, I know you want to talk about the science that we do in the first place.
So I guess what I wanted to talk about picks up quite a bit on what Nick's just talked about. So I work in pregnancy research, and I think probably amongst most of you in the audience, your immediate default would be, we can't do research on pregnant women. We can't do research in pregnancy. And actually, when we get that wrong, it's catastrophic. And we're getting that, we got that wrong very recently. And I'm sorry to bring you back all too quickly to the pandemic. But pregnant women were excluded from all of the vaccine trials. So there were no trials of vaccines, including pregnant women, until June of this year. And yet we were recommending vaccination for pregnant women from end of December. On the basis of no evidence as to the effectiveness, and importantly for women who having to make their own decisions about whether to have the vaccine, no evidence about safety. So because of a default exclusion of pregnant women, not even offering them the choice to take part in a trial, we're now in the position of huge vaccine hesitancy. I lead investigations of all maternal deaths in the UK. We've got more women dying in pregnancy of COVID now than we had in the first wave or the second wave because of the very, very low vaccine uptake rates. And you contrast that to the treatment trials, so the recovery trial, which many of you will have heard about, which discovered the benefits of dexamethasone, which then transformed our treatment of COVID, included pregnant women from the start. So we've therefore been able to ensure that pregnant women can get evidence-based treatments, but we've not got the evidence we need to guide prevention, which for me, and I'm in the position of hoping that in 9 years' time we'll be able to say, exactly as you've just said for polio, that this has turned into a success story by making sure this doesn't happen again. That we change what we're doing next time to make sure that we include pregnant women in those trials so that we can treat them as well as everybody else.
Marion, can I just ask you, you're speaking as someone with an air of like exasperation around this, and so you presumably feel this isn't the first time that we need to look at the methodological approach we're taking, how we're actually doing the research, that we're perhaps a bit resistant to.
Exactly that.
Right.
I think we there's a default gatekeeping that, this is the fault of us as researchers, the regulatory authorities, that we think, oh, no, we mustn't do that. But actually, let's talk to people, let's talk to pregnant women, for me, the fundamental thing we have to do is ensure that we're talking with the people that we're doing the research to help at the very beginning. And many pregnant women would be happy to participate in trials. Not everybody is, but many are. And if we don't offer it, we'll never have that evidence. And it is, as you say, a frustration.
Well, in that aspect, I'm thinking similar themes to what Nick was raising.
Exactly.
Would you say that having made this mistake, as you say, it is a mistake that was made, would you say you're now optimistic, that research methods, research practices are able to learn enough sufficiently quickly from making those mistakes?
I'd say hopeful rather than optimistic.
Hopeful. Okay.
Hopeful.
Great, thank you. Stuart, can I come to you now? Because obviously one of the things that, and I know there's many subjects you always find very interesting in the novel, but there are many subjects you can talk about. But what I'm particularly interested in is you look at where we kind of, not only do we get it wrong, we don't ask the right questions, we miscommunicate and fail to involve people, but actually we just get it wrong in the sense that we believe something, or that, you know, something is put out there that misleads us purposefully, wrongly.
Yeah, if you ask scientists whether they've ever committed fraud, if you just ask them straight up, have you ever falsified or fabricated your data? Around about 2% of them say, yes, I have in fact done that, which is a terrifying statistic.
Yeah.
And then you think, actually, well, given that many of them are not going to admit that they've committed fraud, it's probably much higher than that. If you ask them, do you know anyone else, like a colleague, who has committed scientific fraud, 14% of them say they know someone who they think has committed scientific fraud. That is, you know, fabricated a data set, just made it up from scratch, or taken a real data set and fiddled around with the numbers in an overtly fraudulent way. And we've seen this again and again and again throughout the scientific literature in many different fields. There's a great website called Retraction Watch, where you can see every time a scientific article is retracted, often for fraud. And you can follow, and they even have a leaderboard of the most retracted scientists. It's like the opposite of the Nobel Prize. You do not want to be on that list. And the current leader of the Retraction Watch leaderboard, the top #1 guy, is a guy called Yoshitaka Fujii, who's a Japanese anesthesiologist who made up loads of trials that he claimed to have done that were never done. And he's had 185 papers retracted from the scientific literature, if you can believe that. And you know, here's an example. This is an example of, you know, science going very wrong because there was this terrible inertia in the literature about correcting that. Questions were raised about Fujii's research to the editors of the journals that he published in about 10 years before anything was done about retracting his articles from the literature. They were sitting there for a decade. He continued to publish more and more fake studies. And nothing was done about it. That is an extreme case. That's the most extreme case that we know about. I mean, there's probably lots of frauds out there that we haven't caught yet, maybe smarter people who are hiding their tracks a little bit more. But I think there's a kind of a gradation from fraud into just bad research practices that make scientists, give scientists the ability to put their thumb on the scale a little bit and push the results in the direction that they want. And I would say, you know, to answer the question of the event, you know, how a bad thing can be turned into a good thing, getting it wrong can be turned into something good. In the last 10 years, we've got to know better those kinds of things that researchers do. So not just the outright fraud, and we're slightly better, I think, now at detecting outright fraud using statistical tools and various things like that, but also just knowing the sorts of statistical techniques that scientists can use that weight the odds in their favor, that make it an unfair test, that and new techniques of making them kind of have their hands tied a little bit and stop them from just mucking around in the data, dredging through a data set to find any old thing and publishing it. So I think we're very far away from solving these problems. We've got serious problems with the integrity and the robustness and the quality of the scientific literature that we see published now. You know, the difference between what actually is done in the lab or in the field or whatever it is, and then what you see in the scientific literature is quite dramatic and quite scary. But I think we are better now at identifying these things, and even just having these kinds of conversations, I think, can turn the really scary aspect of this into something good.
Okay, Stuart, but you're not suggesting that the likes of people who come top of the league table on Retraction Watch are just in need of a little bit of re-education about their methods, right? There's quite a big ocean between those two.
Yeah,
things,
absolutely.
Right?
I mean, there are all sorts of things that we could chat all night about the things we can do to catch fraudsters, and there's all sorts of interesting statistical techniques, as I say, to kind of pick out, well, that data set doesn't look like it was made by actual collecting data. It looks like it was made by a human being, and you can tell the sorts of numbers that would appear in that data set don't quite look as random as they should be, and so on. But also, I think our standards are too low, right? The peer reviewers, when they're reviewing articles, often are really rushed. They've got loads of other things on. They don't get access, in almost all cases, to the actual data, right? They're given the paper that the scientists have produced, which has tables of summaries and all sorts of stuff, but they don't actually see the raw data. And if they had more time and they can look at the raw data, I think you would start to see, wait a second, this part of the spreadsheet is duplicated entirely from this part, and various things that happen all the time. I mean, I've been watching recently, again, to go back to the pandemic, several fraud cases appearing of on the drug ivermectin, which just seems to be, fraud cases seem to be tumbling out of that. They're all published in peer-reviewed journals. Someone's reviewed them, but they can't have been paying that much attention, which is a very scary thing.
Yeah, that's a really good moment. We're going to come over to Alexander now as an editor and just dump all this right on his plate. Before I do, I just wanted to just say something about the, that it's worth sort of saying for people, because I know a lot of people attending and at home watching are not necessarily specialists in publishing and journals and so on. It's worth saying that what the consequences are not just some esoteric thing for research when people get it wrong and then it sits in the literature for years and years, but other things can happen too. I'm talking about the fraudulent side of things. Other things can happen too. So you can have people who go on recruiting patients to trials which are going nowhere, because they are not being questioned in the way that they should for the way that they're conducting that research. And so there are quite a lot of consequences, sometimes not obvious to just, it's not the case, perhaps the anesthesiologist would have been found out if was publishing something right on the hot button subject, but there are consequences for sure. Alexander, what are you going to do about it all?
Well, we're getting better, that's for sure, but let me tell you about what an experience of being an editor for, about 7 years now, editor of materials and design does to you. I look at the title of today's meeting and I want to change the order of words to make it better. I want to say why getting it wrong is good for science. And this just happens because one of the things that we try to do in the journal that I had is to improve the quality of science that we publish, not just to sieve through what comes in, but also to help authors. And I appreciate the extreme cases of fraud, but of course, life is often composed of semitones, and it's not so obvious. And now the answer that I would give to the question, why getting it wrong is good for science, because we're human, because science is done by humans, and because to err is human. And scientists are a peculiar part of our population. They are ambitious, they are vain, they want to get ahead, they want their ideas to be the best, they want everyone to agree with it, and yet we teach them, we try to create a sense in the community of certain honor and attitude to the work that we do. And there's always a tension, and what you mentioned about inclination and some people wanting to go as far as to falsify their results. That happens too, but thankfully I think our scientific system and our scientific discussion is self-writing, because if somebody wants to do that for the purpose of self-promotion, that's one thing, but if they want to do it hoping that their wrong result survives the test of time, then that doesn't work. And so ultimately we're interested in the pursuit of truth, how elusive it may be. We are getting better. This morning I looked at a complaint from somebody about a paper published in Materials and Design in 2010. And okay, it was plagiarized to a certain extent, but there was a reference made to the source, and then at the time we couldn't check the text to highlight every paragraph. Now, of course, we can do it, and it would never happen again. So it was a wasteful paper. It took space. It didn't produce much new, although there were small steps beyond what was pulled from another source. And it happens. I have become more relaxed about it. I'm more concerned about the things that we discussed, where people falsify the results or people deliberately ignore part of the results. And to make it even more poignant, members of my research group, because I'm also a researcher, know that saying that we jokingly sometimes use: never repeat a successful experiment. and you'll appreciate what I mean, because there is a temptation to believe that this is the truth that you found, and you have to be resilient and persistent to end up wanting to check again and again. again and again. And the point is that it's a never-ending process. And I was very pleased to hear some examples that were given by our colleagues on the medical side. I didn't start out my life as a researcher on the medical side. I was more on the materials for aerospace, etc. But progressively I've become involved with subjects such as caries, dental decay, and so on. And you find that it's a very rich and complex and interesting interaction between hard science, as you would call it, and applications in real life. And so we try to distill some lasting, fundamental approaches, not even truths. What is truth? I mean,
I'm going to stop you right there because otherwise,
sorry, you stopped me at an opportune
you might have,
moment.
you might have the answer to that question, and then where would we be? But you've said something that's possibly a bit alarming to people, which is that that you're really okay with the idea of scientists.
Of course.
That science suffers from all of the human frailties and so on, but that so what kind of in a way, because in the end somehow we're not looking to individual scientists, we're looking to processes, we're looking to that broader research conversation to find it out.
Let me make it clearer. I understand what you're saying, and I agree that it's a matter of concern, but we all believe that crime is wrong, right? But we haven't been able to eradicate it completely. It still happens. And similarly, I believe that we will never be able to get rid of it completely.
Sure.
It's a question of the degree to which we can control it. And there is light crime and there is heavy crime, and we are obliged to tolerate to a certain extent, because otherwise publishing would be impossible. It's a good idea to ask referees to check, but in practice they can't do that.
And you don't want to be conservative. You want to find a new, fresh idea. I mean, obviously, absolutely. But I think it's quite important for everyone that we perhaps make a distinction between, as Stuart did, outright misbehaviour, and the fact that actually we're asking questions to which, or we get a bit stuck sometimes in understanding things in a certain way, a certain paradigm, as you love to say over here in Oxford. But we understand things in a certain way, and we just don't move fast enough, and that is alarming to people. I mean, I'm going to take questions. People, do raise your hands if you want to ask questions about any of this. I'm kind of keen to hear. In fact, actually, let's hear from you, just en masse. Who feels really okay with the idea that, that science can't, the science we have today is going to be found wanting tomorrow? I mean, do you feel relaxed about this? Okay. You feel pretty relaxed about that it's going to change, right? Most of what you believe today is going to change tomorrow. Okay. And anyone feel alarmed by that? No, so a little bit, okay, a little bit alarmed by that, okay. But do ask questions about this, and stick your hand up, and I'll come over to you. But we'll keep the discussion going. I think people at home can ask questions down here. Can we get questions through down here if they come? Someone's going to let me know. So, is that right?
I think it depends as well on the subject matter, right? So if it's a life and death thing, it's a area of more concern, perhaps.
Right. So the question was, it depends, right? Whether it's a life and death thing, or it's something that doesn't have kind of those obvious consequences, those immediate consequences. Nick, can I come back to you about some of this? Because this is stuff that, as a journalist, you've thought about. I want to start to pick apart this idea of the processes of science. They fail, right? We know how to run an experiment today because we got it wrong before. And we've got to have a conversation about that without it all seeming like it's all a bunch of rubbish, or it's similar to people who are publishing that Stuart finds out.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting, because I was reflecting on the title for the session, and I thought, actually, in a way, it reflects the dysfunction at the heart of science in some ways, and it points to the solution. So the thing is, the way that we communicate about science is very much in tension with the practice of science. So science I was talking to a colleague the other day, and we were kind of like, science is the incremental, systematic reduction of uncertainty. But when you think about what you communicate, it's tell me the facts, tell me what they mean. And that's what people expect. And and actually, those of us who are involved in the practice of science, those of us who are involved in the communication of science, we indulge that. This narrative of the hero scientists who was basically like Einstein, went off in a lab somewhere and came up with a solution, then told the world, and we were forever changed. This is very enduring, but very problematic. And it's true, the problem is that actually, of course, the consequences can be quite high, but we've actually learned to deal with that in the way, the ethics that we apply to experiments, the way that we deal with placebo and stuff like that. So we are actually quite capable of doing that. And it's really interesting to me because I do think what we need to be doing is to be communicating at least as much about how science functions, how it works, the practice of science, as we are about the people involved and the findings. And it's really interesting because SciDevNet, which is this platform that supports science journalism for low and middle income countries, they did a big global survey of science journalists, and they were saying 71% of those samples said that it's true they don't communicate enough about how science works, about the practice of science. And I thought that's fascinating, particularly in view of this point about how much knowledge is generated and how quickly it's generated now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one of the things, isn't it, that when the authority of science is being leaned upon to get society to behave in a certain way, everyone stays quiet about these other issues around the processes, don't they? Because we all hope that everyone's going to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And then we kind of get upset then when people don't understand the process of science and think that it is all about orthodoxy. I think some of that messaging comes from maybe not the science community itself, but from those who talk about the science community or talk about science. As you say, the way that we take the individuals and we make them into gurus in our lives rather than understand the processes that they went through to understand their issues.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, as a scientist, when you're having to do this communication as well, that the issue for me is that the questions that I am asked are wanting me to give a definitive answer. Yeah. And I can't. A lot of the time, for example, there's big disparity in outcomes for Black and Asian women, pregnant women, compared with white women. People want me to give them a single answer. What can we do? What can we change now that is going to make a difference in terms of maternal health?
Yeah.
And I can't give them a single answer, and that is not that. People don't like to hear that, and the uncertainty of science. So the multidimensional, the being able to communicate. Well, I think all of these things are really important to be able to say, well, a little bit of it's explained by this, and a bit by this, and a bit by this, but that's not the answer that a quick 2-minute interview or a short media article is going to be able to give. But then maybe that doesn't give people confidence in the science. If I can't stand up and say, this is the answer, maybe then the confidence is less. So I absolutely agree that, we communicating the uncertainty and the processes that are involved, the challenges with the types of data we use that will never give us definitive answers is really important.
Do you have any researchers in? Who research? Okay, I'm gonna pick up some people down here. Right. I can't come running up to you because we've got a camera. But who's prepared to just let me know? Do you feel like your way of investigating is understood? Do you feel like this point is misunderstood in society?
From my experience, it's not very well understood.
So your experience is not as well understood, and where is your experiences in what area? Oh, right, okay, right on the front line, okay. And there's some other people on this side. Who feels well understood? Somebody else? Yeah, down here.
Thanks a lot. I think it's the understanding. It depends on the subject of what we are researching.
What's your subject?
Dental caries.
Right.
So it's really close to people's life, and I can explain it very well. Yes, with some uncertainties, but I can educate people about the outcome of this disease that affects everyone's life, and the mass percentage of population that affected by this disease. So I can really get more understanding about my research as well.
Okay, that's interesting.
Thank you.
So picking out uncertainty, which there was a comment there for those watching at home, a comment there about picking out uncertainty and levels of understanding about that. I wonder whether that is something that is fundamentally misunderstood, is that everything is uncertain. But it almost feels like we don't have a binary here, do we? I mean, we don't have it we don't know, or we do know. Stuart, you're trying to deal with this in your book because you've got to make these distinctions, haven't you, between tentative knowledge and...
There's clearly some areas of science that we know better than others, or some questions that we know better than others. But the problem is when, and we can all kind of come up with things like the laws of gravity are really well, understood in some ways, and maybe not in others, but in some ways, back in early 2020, the specific treatments that helped coronavirus patients were not at all known, and now they're a little bit better known, but not as well known as some of the laws of physics and so on. So you can kind of draw gradations, but the problem is that people have such strong opposing opinions on these things. And I wish I knew the answer to communicating uncertainty and also communicating a solid message. We need a clear message in a pandemic. We had Hands, Face, Space, for instance, which was trying to communicate something about the way the virus spread. But of course, we discovered as time went on that actually it doesn't really spread by hands. It spreads by, it's in the air and so on. And so it would have been nice to be a bit more light on our feet and adaptive with changing the way we communicate things.
But thinking about the comment here about if it's a life or death situation, you can understand why, because it's one thing to say, is Pluto a star?
Right.
Right. But it's quite another to say, you're going to stick that in my arm and my child's arm, and and all that, and what are you telling me? You're uncertain. So we do need to have a conversation around the fact that uncertainty doesn't mean anything could be true.
Yeah,
right.
NASA
we need to name it a bit more clearly.
I'm a psychologist, so I have like severe envy of physics and engineering and NASA. And NASA is has this sort of traffic light system or kind of gradation system of technology readiness levels. So they have, at the bottom of it, it's things like, here's an idea we've come up with, and maybe we've got a few equations, and then you go up through the readiness levels, and at the very top, it's, we have launched a rocket using this technology, and it works, and we brought people back down to Earth, or whatever it is, we brought the technology back, and it works perfectly. And they tell people about this, they talk about this, when they're talking to maybe their funders or discussing things within NASA. They say this is technology readiness level 4, so we need to do a bit more research before it gets up to 5 or whatever. And we don't really have that for other areas of science, and I wish we did. We had some kind of an evidence readiness level to say, the vaccines are now at this level because we've done a randomized controlled trial in a huge population. It's really good. Whereas, ivermectin or something is not that because we've got really low quality research, and so maybe even just something simple like a gradation like that would help us, and we could learn from launching rockets, which is always cool.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. We always want
Especially
to do that. We always want to end up coming back to the rockets. Yeah. And speaking of which, someone who used to fund stuff like that in her past job is Louise Thompson. She now works for Elsevier and has written a really fantastic piece, which I do recommend you all read. It's on Elsevier Connect, and it really sets out the themes of this. I loved it. But Leslie, I want to talk to you a bit about this whole idea of sort of the settled and the unsettled questions, because, both from a publishing point of view, but also from a funding point of view, you've had to deal with kind of like, how out there is this idea, and is it worth funding or publishing?
So in all the time I've worked in research as a researcher, but also as a funder and now in a publisher, I think there's a really interesting fact that is rarely shared. So most people, when they do the first year of their PhD, they repeat whatever somebody's done before. And that doesn't normally work out, actually. But actually we move forward, and then we go back. And somehow, there aren't perfect answers very often in research. You grope around, you get a bit further. And we all should be confident in talking about the discovery process. And actually, hardly anyone does. If I ask anyone here who's doing a PhD is a really lousy experience, because your first year, you're repeating what somebody else has done, and it doesn't work. And then are you wrong? Are they wrong? But we move forward. And I think we don't have that language of explaining the process. We talk about the results, and even how a scientific paper is written allows people to look at the idea you had, the method you've had, the discussion. It's not definitive. It's your best stab at moving the subject forward. And you're fallible because you're human and everybody has good days and bad days. But I don't hear the scientific community exploring that space or being comfortable exploring that space with the broader public. And that's my experience of 30 years of, you know.
Okay, so that leaves us with the question about where that's coming from, doesn't it? Like, is that defensiveness? Is that not knowing how to talk about that subject? We've got a question over there. Is it related on this point or a new one? Okay, let's pass that back.
So I guess I'd say, you know, I think lots of researchers and scientists, we all kind of know as a community that people get things wrong all the time, and we ask questions and maybe the answer is like, well, you do your experiment and actually your results that nothing changes. But I'd say one of the reasons that doesn't tend to get kind of brought forwards into the public domain is that actually the reward for you as a career researcher in terms of attempting to publish or share results when you've done an experiment and your result is, oh, well, nothing actually happened, is absolutely minimal. So I guess my question for the panel is, how do we encourage early career researchers and just scientists more generally to share these experiments and their data when their data is, well, my null hypothesis has remained, I've not proven anything, because that data probably is useful to someone, but at the moment your benefit in sharing it is just nothing.
Right, so for anyone who's kind of outside the circle on this question, so we're talking about null hypothesis publication, and so what this basically means is there's a selection bias of what you see naturally in the literature, which is that if it's novel and interesting and something happened that people got excited about, it gets published. And if it's boring and didn't kind of take you anyway, one way or the other, you kind of need to know that that's gone on as a scientist, but for, you know, it doesn't really strike the editor as something they should publish necessarily, does it, Alexander?
Well, as an editor or as a researcher, you sit down with a PhD student and they want to write things down chronologically, and you say, no, don't do that. Let's pretend.
You don't do that, do you? No, she didn't do that.
Let's pretend that you knew all along what you ended up with as your final knowledge by the end of your 3 years. So I agree, but I think, Leslie, there is hope because, yes, the scientific publishing as we know it brings with it certain strictures. You expect and I look for papers and I say to authors, where is the element of discovery in what you present to us, right? And people sometimes are taken aback and we say, right, let's have a look at your highlights. This is a statement of action. This is a known fact. This is something that doesn't contain any meaningful conclusion and nothing is left. So if you want to pull out something, there must be an element of surprise. There must be an element of, another thing that we look for in our journal is implication for design, meaning that it has to be useful in some way because of the nature of the journal. There are other places for that kind of stuff. But another answer to the question, why it is important to get it wrong, because it brings the situation to a crisis. And that paradoxically results in a new approach and a new resolution. And Einstein is a very good example. By the end of 19th century, physics was in a crisis. And so Einstein comes out in 1905, Annus Mirabilis, with a number of papers, one of which is special theory of relativity, which has no references. Zero references, and doesn't contain anything new. All the equations are due to Lorentz from before and so on. So how come it creates this revolution? And it turns out that it's a paradigm shift. It's a change of emphasis, it's a change of angle from which we look.
Okay, we're gonna keep this theme going more broadly. I know there are some questions online, so I want to take them in case they're on this same subject, but I do want to keep on the paradigm shift thing because I think sometimes people believe, I did mention it before, they believe that because we don't know everything, anything could be true. And I think we do need to kind of talk about, you know, maybe is that playing a role that people are so defensive? Anyway, we'll come back to that, but there's a comment online.
So the first comment was around confidence and researchers and how they communicate. Sometimes it's a little dogmatic. And so there's a question here about how do we build humility? Because when a researcher speaks with confidence and almost kind of it presents a dogma, and then the evidence changes, there's an element of backtracking. And so at the very first instance, perhaps a bit more humility could be built. So how do we build humility at the same time as building confidence and trust?
Okay.
That's what the question was.
Great. You meet both of those things in clinical research, don't you, Marianne?
So I daren't admit to being an epidemiologist these days because of exactly that. So some people who were, and I'm afraid I stick to very much to my area, but there were people who were interested in their 15 minutes of fame, who would stand up and be that dogmatic, perhaps not with no humility. And I agree, I don't think it was good and is good for science communication. But people wanted, or the perception was that people want to grasp onto something real, some fact. And we do have to change the culture to accepting that there will always be an element of uncertainty, and perhaps think better about how we express that. And thinking about risk is an example. So David Spiegelhalter and some of the risk communication that he was always my go-to person for how to actually express what we do know and what we don't know. So the very simple analogy, if you get in the beginning, if you get COVID, your risk of dying from COVID is the same as your risk of death over the next year, which immediately puts it into a position that we all understand what is our risk for us as an individual. So being able to put simple things like that and change the communication, I think, is really important. Just picking up on the problem is, as researchers, we survive by competition. I am funded by research grants, so I have to show something to get my next research grant, and that doesn't help because we then the pressure is on us to be that person that can show we've made a big discovery. I do think it should all be published, and I think some of the funder policies now, which insist that whatever you do is published, is really important, so that we don't have the research waste. Because if you don't know that somebody's done an unsuccessful experiment, you'll just go on and do it again, and none of that will help. And by random chance, once it will work out the other way around, and then the confidence goes when that's shown not to be the case.
To sort of pick out your earlier point there about sort of humility, sort of tied to that, I think it was a feeling of I got from what you were saying of that we need to give people a bit of credit as well, to kind of find that, to help people find their way through this discussion and not just assume that we can't have this conversation with people. We just have to message them. That we should have a grown-up conversation about what is your risk.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Rather than just kind of put them into categories where they're messaged. It's an interesting thing. I'm going to share this with you. I mean, it's actually under embargo, but it's my organisation. I'm going to share this. So I've got a story coming out next week. So Ipsos Mori, the pollsters, have done some work with us, and they've talked to MPs and they've talked to the public about when you change your mind, when the government changes their mind or the science changes. The evidence changes rather, does that lead to loss of credibility? And MPs are far more worried about that loss of face, and that they think you lose face by changing your policy in response to new evidence. The public was really low. Something like only about a third of people thought maybe it does in any degree. And I thought that was interesting, that they were actually a bit more chilled out about the idea that ideas change, we move with the ideas. We need to have a grown-up conversation.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And in fact, I was thinking, one of the big issues here is about finding the space, public space, for that kind of discourse. It's not actually about the same communication around, breakthroughs and innovations. This is a different thing. It's a bit like, I'm a big fan of podcasts. Elizabeth Posner, she has a podcast called How to Fail, which is fascinating. And it's a kind of, and that's, she brings big people on there, but actually the whole point of it is that this is a conversation about the things that we don't normally talk about. And I think that actually it's really about creating that as well. And so it's not just, when we think about science and publishing, we think breakthroughs, we think about what actually Alexandra was just describing, but in fact, no, we ought to have a space where it's other stuff. The other thing I was going to say very quickly, because this is so fascinating to me, when we talk about uncertainty and risk, the IPCC, the big climate conference in 2010, they engaged a bunch of consultants communication consultants. And these consultants came back to him and said, there are a few words that you really ought to avoid using. And one of them is uncertainty and the other one is risk. And they said, because the way that it's understood by scientists is not the way that these words are understood by the public, particularly not by policymakers.
Okay.
Which I think is, I mean, it says it all.
Yeah. So rather than actually put the work in to kind of cross that bridge, yeah, that's interesting. You've posed an interesting idea there in terms of as we kind of move, we've got another 20 minutes of conversation, and we're going to have drinks as well to talk. But you've posed an interesting idea of actually just popularising this, popularising something like, an experiment fails or we learn how to do things better. I've got another comment from the online group, and then I'll come over here and hear for more, 3-4 more questions. Yeah.
So it's a dual question. Two people have asked a similar sort of thing. One of them is a bit of a follow-up to Leslie's point about the reproducibility, and if a first year of a PhD is basically reproducing someone else's work, and if you can't reproduce it because the paper that you're referring to doesn't give you the information that you need to use to reproduce it, that paper, should it be published? That's one question. And then the other question is about conflicting evidence. And so if what does the panel feel about apparently opposing research findings and the impact of that on public perception and buy-in to research?
Right. Okay. We're going to conflicting evidences. I think we're going to come on to dealing with. I'll come to Stuart in a minute. But I want to take some comments and some questions from around the audience as well, because there's quite a lot of hands going up here. So, chap here, third row back. Can you say if you're a researcher and what field you're in? Because there's quite a difference of experience there.
Thank you very much. So I'm currently working at Elsevier as a software engineer, so completely different but my background is somewhat in engineering. So my question was basically this, somebody mentioned the climate topic, and it was just very interesting to read in the newspapers about the UN climate report and how some of the oil-rich companies are lobbying against just weakening some of those arguments. And I think, in my opinion, sometimes it's just to do with, since we can't really change reality, we have to change the eyes through which we see reality. So involving all those other stakeholders, from smaller countries to have a say, some of the island countries to have a say in these reports and what's going on, what is their impact, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, totally see what you mean. And it kind of relates actually back to this point that Stuart was talking about. I'll come back to you in a moment, Stuart, which is that there's people who are out to do fraud, and there are also people who have got financial reasons to kind of stick to a particular argument and so on. Now, go behind you. I'm going to come to you on that in a moment, Stuart, and say, well, don't we just have to change the lens? Don't we have people like you writing books and great articles?
Many thanks. I was also wanting to poke on one of Stuart's points. It's about the grades of evidence and a kind of NASA example. It seems to me that there's grades of evidence within fields, and also in different fields there's different likelihood of science or something being wrong. I am a researcher. I sit between medicine and economics. In economics, a lot of research is about telling a story. Economics papers are now about 50 pages long, 40 pages of introduction, about 2 pages of methods, and about 5 pages of discussion at the end.
Sound brilliant.
It's great, and I wonder, it seems to me that kind of research is more likely to get it wrong than something that's perhaps a bit more data-driven. On the other side, more qualitative research I'm interested in, because in some senses, drawing themes out of what people say seems to be very much dependent on what the researcher's views and what they might want to draw from it.
Right.
So I wonder whether different fields, we have attract a health warning to psychology research because of its replicability. But I wonder, is there anything we can learn from different fields that get it right more often?
Yeah. I do feel sorry for the 3 good psychology researchers that have done things in experiments who are tarred with this brush all the time. Stuart, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, well, there's lots of fossils everywhere, so we should mention the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who said lots of things I disagree with and lots of things I agree with. But one of the things I agree with was that in a world where scientists are rewarded for clean and unambiguous discoveries about stuff, exciting discoveries, then you will see lots of unconscious. I think the word he used was finagling of the research, but also all sorts of other biases and indeed in some cases outright fraud. And the fundamental problem with the way that research is published is that it's published on the basis of its results. Journal editors and scientists who are just sending stuff to journals will send it to journals. Journal editors will choose to publish it. Reviewers will give it a better review on the basis of its results and not necessarily on its methods. So one fundamental change we could make is to review papers before there are any results. That is, scientists send in the plan for the study and get it peer reviewed. So this is called a registered report, and in fact, it was pioneered at an Elsevier journal, I must say, at Cortex. My conflict of interest is the editor was my PhD advisor, but he and Chris Chambers from Cardiff University came up with this great idea of a registered report. So you send in your method for peer review, and the peer reviewers say, "Oh, I think you should change that. That won't quite work. Use this statistical analysis. Do all this. Plan it all out. Have it all set, and then you go off and collect the data." And the journal says, and this is the fundamental changes, the journal says, we'll publish it, whether it's an exciting result, whether it's completely disappointing, whether it's ambiguous and we don't know what it means, we'll publish it either way. You go off, you get the data, and then as long as you've done what you said you would do, the journal publishes it. I don't understand. I'm actually working on a registered report right now with one of my PhD students. I don't understand why we don't do this for every scientific paper. There are some areas of science where it might not work as well as others, maybe. But this should be the fundamental way of publishing science.
That is definitely an idea that's on the table right now in societies. It's worth people who don't know about this to know it. It's a discussion that's going on that we should have more early stage discussion about, is your research actually going to find the answer you're looking for? I mean, that's effectively what we're saying. Is it designed to find the answer?
Yeah, because afterwards, you send in a badly designed piece of research to the journal. It's just something Ronald Fisher said. If you show a statistician the analysis after it's done, he can't help you make it better, but he can tell you what it died of. In other words, it's kind of a post-mortem situation. He can say, well, you did the wrong thing here. Sorry, there's not much I can say about going back. And I would have been able to tell you how to set up your experiment better if you'd sent me this before you collected any of the data. So.
Which is it's also talking up to the sorts of things we're talking about over here, isn't it? Which is actually having a bigger conversation about whether our research it's even including the right people to find the answer. I mean, Nick, that's another big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, no, for sure. And sorry, I was just going to say, because in fact, this is the thing, because while we acknowledge that getting it wrong can be good for science, there is one type of wrong which is definitely not good. And that is actually this moral issue, the moral imperative to be inclusive and to be socially responsible. And I think that's a wrong that's not often corrected. I mean, Marian's just talking about this now. We were talking earlier actually about the example of the pulse oximeter, which is this thing, that it measures the level of oxygen in your blood. Quite important with COVID treatment because it determines whether or not you need oxygen therapy. And the way it works is it basically measures the light in the blood, and there's a big issue. There's a 1 in 3 chance that actually if you are black or brown, you will get an error in your reading. And the reason for this is because actually when it was designed, certainly back in the 70s, there was no diversity in the sample. This was pointed out, interestingly, in the 1980s. There was a paper that identified this as a problem. It was again discussed through the 90s as an issue that needs to be addressed at some point, somehow, somewhere. Nothing happened. It's not been investigated. It's not really changed. Now, actually, apparently the FDA have a thing where if you're doing a study, you have to have 2 people of dark pigmentation.
Right.
In the whole sample. You just need 2 people of dark pigmentation.
Wow.
And that continues, and we saw the consequences, very material consequences, in the outcomes for black and brown people in the pandemic.
Well, we've also seen outcomes of similar nature with all the use of AI in healthcare to look at moles, haven't we? Which were all tested on the wrong skin colour for half the world. So, there were danger actually in some of these areas in data science that they can be replicated. So what we're saying is kind of true of that too. There are some more questions. Let's go around the room now. So the woman there. Somebody with a jumper, I can just see your jumper. That's a very nice jumper, yeah.
Hi, I think as a society, we are failing to be comfortable with uncertainty. So I'm a medical doctor and I'm also doing my PhD right now. When I consult my patient...
Did you like your first year? Can I just ask you?
I'm a second year. And my research completely novel, so thanks God I don't have to repeat anyone's results. You know, everything I come across, like my supervisor are like, oh wow. What I wanted to say is, like, as a surgeon, when I go consult my patient, it's okay and it's kind of acceptable to tell them, like, oh, I don't know, like there are certain risks that comes with it. And they kind of like accept the idea that we are not too sure about, like, what might happen as a risk. Whereas when I'm like working in a lab or I want to write a grant, I have to be 100% sure about what I'm saying. You know, otherwise it won't get funded. It felt like I have to have a strong opinion about something. Whereas as a doctor, I don't need to have that. And I still, like, you know, I can function. Whereas as a scientist, I have to say, like, oh yeah, I think this is how it's going to work. And then we get funded for it. They don't fund us to experiment with different ideas. They fund us to experiment with one idea, and then you have to be sure that it's going to work.
And that's in which field?
Medical
in general,
research.
In general,
Yeah.
okay. That's an interesting perspective. So, for anyone who couldn't hear that at home, that was suggesting that you have to be more definitive in a lab environment than you do in a clinical setting, where you're used to dealing with things being, you know, talking about things in more uncertain terms, hedging bets, or, you know, looking at probabilities. Aaron, do you agree with that?
So I do often reflect that the older I've got, the more enabled I feel to say I don't know.
Right.
And so I think it is. I wouldn't say that one has to be as definitive in a grant application. I think you do. You do have to tell a story, so you do have to convince the funders that there is something there, but there is still an element of uncertainty. But I think you're right in that when one is having individual conversations in a clinical setting, it is very different from the more the conversations at a population science level. Because you can individualize every conversation, whereas if you're talking to a whole audience, I can't make the conversation individual for all of you, which is where, you know, some of the risk communication and coming up with a solution that every individual can apply to them, I think is really important. So,
but perhaps there's a clue there, because perhaps we can just learn from the fact that it's possible to have that sort of a conversation with most people, and then think about in terms of conversation when we think about this population level.
So
right?
that's it for me, is that when I want to communicate my results, I get together a whole group of lay, of voluntary organisations, talk with them about how they understand it, and that's how I get the message of what I need to communicate at a population level.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And perhaps there's a lot for us to be thinking about in relation to why we have confidence in some settings when we talk, you know, when we talk with somebody in a conversation in which we have these sorts of discussions, we have more confidence than when someone's messaging at us.
Yeah.
And maybe there's something for us to be learning here about what researchers need to get better at communicating. Right, I'm going to whiz through because there's more hands going up. So let's take a few questions together and then we'll try and unpick them. Please raise your hand again. If I saw you the first time, I may now miss. There's one right at the back here. Yeah. And then we'll come through to the two down here.
So when I was doing my PhD, one of the things that I found was that everyone got very, very specific into their own fields. So I was in astronomy, and frequently I couldn't figure out what the person 2 fields down or 2 even doors down from me was actually doing. And I think that this can be a problem with the growing accessibility of science. When you read a paper's abstract, if you're not in the field, it can be very, very difficult to understand what is happening. So one of the things that I saw put in place to address that was with a journal, I think called to do with AGU in geophysics, where every single abstract is required to have a plain text abstract underneath in simple language so that the layperson can understand, so that it's not just here it is in a series of code that nobody else is going to understand. And I think that's great.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a question about whether everything should have a plain text abstract on it and whether that takes us down the road. But it started with a point about the fact that you're driven into kind of a silo, or you're driven into a very narrow part of research. I know, actually, Louise Thompson, who spoke earlier, I know has been very at the forefront of trying to change that, think about ways that we can stop that. And I mean, given that Elsevier is one of the biggest publishers, the biggest publisher of science in the world, it's quite good maybe to have that conversation about how to equip researchers to communicate their research better, not just their research, but to think about the wider field of discussion going on around your research. There's no skills from that coming from universities at the moment, which is frustrating. So there could be something perhaps coming from more from the publishers. Let's come down the front here.
Thanks very much. Been really interesting discussion so far tonight. And my question is a little bit more focused on the sort of comparative quality of research and how that gets communicated to the messengers of science, be that the media on breakfast television or tabloids, or even to social media, and how we can do better as a sort of scientific community to highlight what is seen within scientific community as better qualities of research over others, while still sort of satisfying the need for balance.
Okay, before we come on to that thing, can I just, and we'll come to you in a moment, can I just come back to our economist friend over here? Because I meant to ask you earlier, do you agree with this idea of, you're absolutely fundamentally opposed to this idea of grading things or giving them a kind of a RAG rating or something?
I wonder how we can do it between fields. So I think that was the point I was trying to get at.
Right.
Is that I think different fields would see strength in different ways. I happen to view economics evidence generally as fairly weak, that I'm seeing in many papers that are published, because they're focusing on a story rather than perhaps on the data. But then we heard from Marion the example of epidemiologists and being driven by the data is quite a difficult thing to understand as well. And
maybe also there's an issue about whether it mystifies then, because it's another kind of peer review, isn't it, to say this is a 5 out of 5, or this is a green or a red or something. It's another kind of peer review. Maybe it's actually, if it's so different between different fields, what that actually means, it could become quite mystifying to people rather than illuminating. Okay, let's come back over here. And I want to pick up that question. Stuart, I'm going to get you to pick up that question down here in a minute.
Hi, I'm a publishing postgraduate student, and I'm doing my dissertation on conspiracy theories and
on
conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories, okay.
Yeah, and yeah, so it's recently I've come across this situation where every time a scientist or a scientific journal is uncertain or wrong in some cases, or sometimes deliberately by certain people who endorse conspiracy theories and stuff, there's a lot of damage going on in terms of like public health when it comes to vaccines and stuff. Mm-hmm. And some of it, I feel like is there are certain case studies I did about anti-vax books and stuff. So is scientific community, like I appreciate Elsevier's like dedication to anti-vax, like the COVID misinformation and stuff, the page. But is scientific community more responsible, or in future will we be seeing more information to combat this phenomenon?
So what kind of information do you think you should see to do that?
For example, in anti-vax information, like Taylor and Francis recently came up with a whole debunking books, but that's not helping because we need something in layman's terms. There is research that's already put out, but I feel like if there is more research in layman's terms rather than by scientists for scientists kind of thing, I feel like maybe there might be something.
So I have an interesting thought about this myself, which I do think what you're raising is very important, but I find it interesting that there's such a wild chase over what is a relatively small number of people in society with a relatively small amount of influence, actually. Meanwhile, there's a really big load of people who are incredibly uncertain what to make of things and are crying out for more science and more information from the research community. So why are you kind of chasing these people over here who really aren't that interested in what you've got to say, instead of actually looking at people who have got an appetite for it and whether what you're saying from the science community is actually registering for them, whether it's something that's even useful for them. It seems to me like there's a bit more of a focus there on, you know, making ambassadors out of a bigger part of society in the first place, perhaps, you know. It'd be interesting to kind of take that approach, maybe. Yeah. But yeah, really good question. Okay, so is there any more things coming through? Oh, we got more online. Okay, we're running out of time now. Do you want to just belt them out at me? And I'm kind of aware that there's a sound of glasses and canapes going on in the corner. Yeah.
So this is about public involvement in the research process. So there's a question about how important does the how important does the panel feel that public involvement with research is effective in the context of communicating research, and then also thinking about how a lot of medical researchers are encouraging patient public involvement in research plans. Could this then be used in other areas? Obviously, particle physics is quite different to medical research, so could it be broadened out, and to what extent?
I would volunteer for particle physics research, yeah. Yeah, okay, that's a really good, and anything further?
Oh, and then there was one more question about the word failure, and sort of the words that we choose as a risk was mentioned, and obviously people like David Spiegelhalter has been doing a lot of work around sort of risk communication. So the words we choose, and failure is one of those words when an experiment doesn't work right, or as planned, and it probably comes back to the idea of putting your proposal of how your research goes forward. Why is failure used, and when something doesn't work?
Right. Do you know what? Maybe we should make a list of toxic words. Like retraction, though, because retraction has become an embarrassing thing. And actually, you need retraction for times when you just made a bit of an error and you need to sort that out. You know, it was nothing nefarious.
Honest mistakes versus deliberate fraud.
Exactly, exactly. And failure, maybe we need to. So Elsevier is one of the reasons why we're in this conversation and doing this event tonight is persuaded now of the need to really investigate this in quite a serious way across the research community. So I'm just going to point out here that I think we should look at what are the toxic words, what are the things that people find. We've had uncertainty mentioned, we've had all sorts of other issues to do with risk and so on, but people are nervous about, and then retraction and failure. And there's all sorts of words, isn't there, that should we be so afraid of these words? Or do we need to make a kind of PR case for the words or reinvent them? So there's a take home for us tonight. There is lots on the table here. I'm going to let you pick and choose. I do want to know whether journals, think about the arbitration of truth and thinking about what more could journals do there. But I'm going to let you pick and choose because my panel is sadly not to people at home, but my panel is going to be available for drinks afterwards. Feel free, when you pick and choose some responses to those questions and comments, feel free also to plug what you'd like to chat to people over drinks about, what they can approach you, or other things that you've got going on and issues that we haven't covered tonight. So please do plug that too. But I'm going to take my panel now just for some final closing comments. And if you don't feel that your answers came from them or from me or from the wider discussion, come and talk to us afterwards and pursue it, please. Thank you very much for joining us. Nick, do you want to take it away?
Okay, so two things, and this relates, I think, to the last two questions. I really want us to start thinking less about science communication as broadcasting and more about it as mediation. Wow. And the reason I say that is because there are two things about this, right? So one is that actually you start thinking a lot more about relationships as opposed to information. And the other is that actually, and this goes back to a point that was raised online, is that it also speaks to how you are engaging with the community, society that you're meant to be serving. I heard in a conference recently this idea that actually maybe we should communicate not so much to educate, but more to provide tools, which I think is a really lovely, liberating idea, actually. The other thing is actually our fetishization of information, as if that's going to solve the problem. It's going to be the panacea. Actually, because information in itself is still subject to co-option, and it's not really the thing. What's really interesting is what happens between the information and the sense making and the decision making. And that's the bit where, when we talk about, sort of getting the science wrong, what we don't talk about very much is the science of science communication.
Great.
Which is a valid, important, under-resourced and under-considered body in itself.
Thank you. Mariam, your minute.
So I guess one thing I haven't said is that we need to recognise the structural biases in the systems that affect what gets out there into the public domain. Obviously, this is me on my soapbox, but if I get another journal editor reply to me to say pregnancy is not of sufficient general interest, I don't know what I'll do. When clearly we are all either pregnant or have been born. But to come back to the question from from online, for me, patient and public involvement is what I thrive on. That for me is how I get the questions right that need answering, and it's how I get the results communicated in the right way. So it's
Fabulous
fundamental.
Message. Yeah, brilliant. Great place to finish.
In short, many of the questions that were raised today about publication, about the mechanism, about the selection, about what's toxic, like retraction, and what's failure, I think they can be answered. I'm very happy to answer each one specifically. Like, for example, no, we're not interested in publishing your plans to do research. Sorry. And it's not going to change. You may create special journals which will do that, but that's the stuff for grant applications. And as a researcher, I would want to publish them because it's part of my inner workings. Why should I share it with reviewers who will steal it? And I'm sorry that happens too. So we need to be realistic about it. And there are other mechanisms. There is hope because, for example, people who work in computing quite often publish information about what didn't work or how they tried something. You look at forum this and forum that, and you see that. So we have already discovered ways to do that. We shouldn't confuse the edifice of scientific publication as we know it, and which evolves, of course, but it is designed for a certain purpose. And it serves this purpose, on the whole, pretty well.
So we should be looking around it rather than burdening it with everything.
Just very important point. People can learn about technical aspects what constitutes a good paper. It shouldn't be flawed in several important respects, and I can list them. And
but don't do it now because we're between people's strings.
I will not. And it shouldn't be flawed in one very important aspect of problem setting, because quite often people select the wrong problem and therefore it's a waste of time. But otherwise, the system is pretty well configured. What we're talking about is things around it.
Alexander, I wish you'd raised problem selection earlier, because this is it's a whole other debate. We need another discussion. We need another event. But I have to stop you there because I want to take Stuart for a final comment.
Well, I think we might just disagree fundamentally about everything, but that's a whole other thing. On the matter of failure, to me, a failed experiment is one where you accidentally drop the test tube on the ground and it smashes, right? And you have to go back to the start. Not one where you don't get the result that you wanted. And the problem is we view experiments where we don't get the result we wanted as a failure, and often we just don't publish them in the first place. That's the main problem. My other point, just in relation to some of the stuff we talked about in terms of misinformation and science communication and so on, I worry a lot about the framing of misinformation. This is maybe my most controversial point. I worry a lot about the framing of misinformation versus the truth, because I just think back to 2020, February 2020, when if you wore a mask, you were seen as someone who was laboring under false information. You'd been misled. You'd been told something that was wrong, and in fact, maybe your brain was a little bit broken. There were psychologists out to tell you why wearing masks was an example of you being over paranoid and things like that. That was all in the news at the same time that the scientific experts were telling the government that actually we should just let the coronavirus rip through the population and infect as many people as possible. That was the plan.
That's really not a kind place to finish for everybody here.
My issue.
Take us bigger.
My issue is that, the fundamental thing is that there shouldn't be a body of of evidence to which we compare the misinformation, right? We should keep questioning and keep asking skeptical questions of everything all the time, and that's how science works.
That is a beautiful point to finish
Thanks.
on. Thank you. I was really worried. We were going to go into drinks and talking about masks.
If we disagree on everything fundamentally,
thank you.
that doesn't mean that either of us is
Science
wrong.
evolves through debate.
Agreed.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Come and have a bit more debate, have a drink. Thank you for joining us online for your brilliant questions. I'm sure we only answered about 50% of them, and then we've got a lot more thinking to do about all of them. So thanks very much. Thank you to the organisers, to the Science Festival, which has been fabulous, and thank you to Elsevier for having the daring to kind of open these horrible questions up and debate them. So brilliant. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you next door. Thank you.